Pocketnow's Galaxy S8 coverage is brought to you by dbrand. Before we jump into the review, a minor oversight: the LG G6 actually represented the first full year of real camera reviews, from one generation of phones to the next. A little milestone that I thought was kind of important, because this means with the Galaxy S8, we have a similar review of the S7 that you all can reference to see how these two might compare. The main talking point for the Galaxy S8 has been this new screen aspect ratio, and very little has been mentioned about camera improvements, which has led some in our audience to worry that there might not be any improvements to this camera. We've shot a ton of footage to check out, so buckle up folks, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm gonna move pretty quick. To spoil some of the conclusion right up front, the Galaxy S8 is definitely an exercise in evolution, not revolution. A lot of the specs on paper will feel exceedingly similar to last year's phones. Same sensor size, same aperture, same number of megapixels, same photo and video modes. We shouldn't be surprised if output feels similar to the S7, but we want to see if this newer image sensor and more powerful processor deliver any improvements over its predecessor. Jumping right in with some daylight shots, Samsung has a reputation for heavy saturation and sharpening, and the S8 is no exception. This looks lush on cooler colors, darker greens, blues, and earth tones, but it can squash detail in warmer colors, like this yellow flower. The sensor is more than capable of retaining petal detail, but the JPEG processing clips some of that texture. And even this lighter green can sizzle a bit in afternoon light. There's a lot of eye candy here, and photos will largely auto-process in a pleasing way. But we still have some concerns with things like blue skies. Grain in blue gradients is a bit busier than we'd like to see, but this color processing feels heavy-handed. This is where I say most cameras have issues with reds, but what concerns me with the S8 was some of the inconsistency in processing red. From the same position, shooting in succession, we end up with noticeably different warmths. Again, the raw file for these bougainvillea blossoms is spot on. Left to its own devices, like most phones, the S8 tends to overexpose, but happily, performance here is far better than most of its competition. Where I often feel like I need to dial back significantly more, I only needed a few minor adjustments on the S8 in the brightest of conditions, and spot metering in manual mode actually landed just a bit darker than I would have wanted. Well done there, Samsung! Moving over to white balance, the S8 plays with warm light in a very satisfying way. Complementing the saturation, there's a pleasing glow to daylight shots. It might not be the most accurate to your subject, not true white, but it does a better job of retaining the feel of the lighting. Objects in shade, likewise, avoid the problem of sliding too cool, where some phones can make a shot like this feel icy or cold. Night shots also err on the side of exposing for the lighting more than the subject. This white gate lit by really ugly yellow security lamps. In general, this is my preferred method of white balance, as I usually want to capture the feel of a moment more than I want some notion of true scientific white. Looking at dynamic range, the S8 captures a fantastic amount of info when saving raw files. Purposely overexposing a shot by 2 stops and walking it back in Lightroom, I couldn't quite recover all the detail in this wall. But looking at what info was still retained, I have no issues with this performance from a phone. A larger sensor, big pixels, and a wide aperture. When this phone is pushed bright, it goes bright, but there's still plenty of safety net here for folks capturing raw images. A very quick look at lens performance, and there are subtle improvements over the S7. I'm seeing a bit less lens flaring in night shots, but a wide field of view paired with the fastest aperture on a phone makes for some hazy elements most noticeable in macro shots. And speaking of macro, this is another use case which hasn't changed much from the S7. Working near the phone's minimum focusing distance, we get the prettiest natural bokeh we've seen from a phone, but this also makes macro shots a bit trickier to pull off. You have a razor-thin plane of focus to work with. We've also noticed in video that the phone doesn't seem to focus quite as close as it can for still shots. Consistently, we had to scooch back a little from where we had landed focus for a photo. Now, in a world of dual sensor cameras, the zoom function on the S8 isn't going to impress anyone. It's a very normal crop zoom that will blur out detail at the farthest end. Any video is just a blown up image with lots of pixelation. This is totally normal performance for a single camera sensor phone. Happily, autofocus speed and accuracy are still on point. It was a genius move to use dual pixel technology on the S7, and we still benefit from it here. It's not any faster than its predecessor, but it really didn't need to be. Looking at high dynamic range, Samsung already layers on quite a bit of image processing, so HDR shots tend to only show a subtle difference from normal auto-processing photos. If anything, most end up looking like they've just been given a slight brightness bump, which is disappointing. I was hoping for more of the highlight and low-light balancing we might see from a phone like the Pixel. Sadly, that's not the case here. Happily, panorama performance remains top tier. Excellent exposure, some subtle wobbles in these power lines, but still, this is one of the only phones capable of correctly piecing together all of the elements of a busy scene like this. This is fantastic image stitching and processing. Now, you should all know by now that I hate reviewing selfie cameras, but Samsung might just have one of the best performers around. Autofocus is definitely appreciated. We get great detail in bright light, solid performance in shade, one of the more natural Odo modes for those people who like to look like disturbing uncanny valley mannequins, and it's still one of the only selfie shooters available that will produce quad HD video. This might be one of the best vlogging solutions available on the market. Moving to some night shots, this hardware continues to guarantee that Galaxies are low-light champs. Wide aperture, solid stabilization, for the most part, night shots are pretty easy to pull off. Our only concern here is the heavy-handed noise reduction. A little grain or texture really isn't a bad thing, especially for retaining detail and clarity. The S8 is not destructive, but sometimes photos are softer than I'd want them to be. This processing can start to resemble a beauty filter when shooting people in medium to low light. Now, this is a terrific capture for a phone. I'm taking the shot blind, handheld, from the rear camera sensor, and you can see this had a long shutter for the car streaking behind me, but I really wished I had captured this in manual mode for the raw image. I just look a bit too plasticky here. At night, we can also see some of the downsides to shooting in auto, where the camera decides for you how long to expose. Trying to be subtle and taking a streak candid, it's really difficult to predict how long the phone will hold the shutter open. And I ended up with a blurry shot. Coming back a few minutes later, so I didn't look like such a creeper, and using the manual mode, it was much easier to lock in a crisp exposure. Even with indoor lighting, say you're trying to photograph kids, auto mode will often make a choice to expose for the environment at the expense of a faster shutter speed. Taking a look at video, the S8 captures a high-quality 50 megabit per second UHD, but still with a 10-minute limit on files, a limit we don't see on phones like the LG G6 or current Huawei's. Most everything we see in still photos will hold true for video in terms of color processing and exposure. Vivid, sharp, saturated, eye-pleasing content, a bit hazy at the macro end, but well warm for outdoor afternoon samples in Southern California. One main difference from stills might be the blockier pixelation in blue skies as the image compression tries to figure out what info is important, but that's not terribly uncommon to see this kind of tearing on most phones. Night video is often significantly brighter than it needs to be though, and the phone obviously can't process moving images with noise reduction filters as well as it can for still photos. Where the phone nailed the creepy tunnel and creepy gate photos, the video feels washed out and noisier than it should be. What's new for Samsung is the ability to shoot UHD video with both software and hardware stabilization, one of the only Android phones capable of such a feat. I shot almost all of the samples using this mode enabled. Now, I'm still not the biggest fan of this hybrid stabilization, as the lens still distorts the scene as the software crops out movement. Even though the frame is more fluid and less bouncy, you can still see how objects in the frame retain that jello-y look. It'll be up to the individual if they prefer that over the more normal wobble we see in only using hardware stabilization. When trying to hold still, this combo does help smooth things out over just using lens stabilization. The concern I have with this feature though, it seems to tax the phone a lot more, and the software processing does not like lateral panning. iPhones and Pixels can get twitchy, but this is terrible stuttering from a phone which is set to be one of the most powerful on the market. Even when you're not panning, expect more dropped frames with this setting enabled. We've had some windy days in LA while reviewing this phone, which has made microphone tests a bit more challenging, but on the whole, Samsung remains an upper-tier performer here. Solid audio capture, good dynamic range, and nice stereo separation. Slowing things down for just a second, the S8 produces some of the better 240 frame per second 720p slow motion we've seen, a small improvement over the S7. This is what the video will look like using Samsung's built-in editing tools, not too shabby. But we were disappointed to see that there's no 1080p option, and nor is there any kind of fancy burst mode like what we might see on Sony phones soon. Samsung definitely has room for improvement on this fun feature. Lastly, we wanted to take a look at the app layout, and as requested by our news editor Jules, a little discussion on that app performance. First, I still feel we're wasting a lot of space in this camera app. The new taller screen doesn't seem to bring any benefit to photography, and unlike LG, Samsung has done nothing to embrace this extra real estate. A perfect example is the manual mode, which still encroaches on your viewfinder to adjust settings. Instead of a mode button, Samsung seems to have been inspired by Huawei in migrating to gestures. Sliding from left to right brings up your mode options, sliding from right to left is where your filters live. This works really well and keeps your viewfinder open when making quick changes in those modes. But I'd still really like to see the main settings menu adopt this layered effect. Consistently, my biggest gripe with Samsung menus, they completely remove you from your composition window and at night, blind you with a bright white background. The changes Samsung focused on are completely unnecessary and do little to improve the camera experience. Pinch to zoom works terrifically well, but Samsung has complicated the shutter button to add a rocker-style zoom in software. This alone has caused me to miss more shots than any other change. This phone isn't the easiest to hold in your fingertips, but now, if you don't nail a perpendicular press of the shutter button, if you hit at an angle or slide even just a little, the phone will think you're trying to zoom. Also annoying for us folks who like manual modes, Samsung has been inspired by LG in providing a gesture to flip from the rear to the front camera. It works great in auto mode, but if you're quickly trying to adjust manual settings, I often found myself making eye contact with myself. It's a tough call expecting people to deliver that kind of user interface accuracy when they're focusing on trying to take a photo. Another LG inspiration, this one more positive for the S8, is the addition of focus peaking. The S7 had a pop-up zoom feature, but from a composition standpoint, locking focus like this is a lot easier to do in the moment. This is a terrific addition. Other than those mentioned changes, Samsung seems more focused on fun things. Super neat! I can slap on some animated skins like I can in Snapchat. I'll never use this ever again. And Bixby Vision is also something I'm not likely to fire up very often. I just don't search for things like this, with a clumsy facsimile of Google image search delivering similar but usually unrelated images. And I just don't care to shop through my camera interface at all, even if it could give me options, which it often couldn't. And lastly, we should talk about speed and processing. The S8 follows the S7 in being one of the snappier performers we've handled, yet this phone doesn't feel quite as consistent as its predecessor. Like LG, we won't remember the 100 times the phone performed quickly as expected, but that one time you really want to capture a shot and the camera lags, that'll stick out like a sore thumb. I had more of those moments with the S8 than I remember having with the S7, but that might just be me romanticizing last year's phone. When shooting video, I regularly encountered a delay between starting the video and being able to focus, often a longer delay than I would find on an air quotes slow shooter like the G6 or how we criticized the V20. The S8 was also routinely one of the slowest phones at saving a video, preventing me from shooting again as quickly as we might from a Huawei or an LG G6. And also, it bears repeating, neither LG nor Huawei have 10-minute limits on their video. It's early days still for the S8, so I'm hoping to see some of these performance issues ironed out in future updates, but for all this extra horsepower in the new Qualcomm 835 chipset, I'm not seeing any real advantage in speed for Samsung this year. So let's wrap this up. Where's that leave us with the camera on the Galaxy S8? Now I'm gonna need y'all to take a nice deep breath. I can already see the SMH comments about how I'm being too nitpicky or how I'm a Samsung hater with the haterade. I need everyone to repeat after me. There is no such thing as an objectively best camera. We can only try and illustrate the pros and cons for you folks so you can make the best purchasing decision you can. I never try to score or rank because this tech evolves quickly over time, even over the life of one particular phone. Instead, I like to look at phone cameras as a spectrum. On one end of that spectrum, we have phones that excel at being auto shooters or feature nifty, crowd-pleasing HDR processing. And maybe those phones don't satisfy the manual shooters or the pro photographers. At the other end of the spectrum, we have phones that deliver incredible control to the consumer, but often those phones might not always have the best auto modes or fun features. My experiences with Samsung in general, and the S8 specifically, land it as one of the better examples of a healthy Venn diagram overlap between these two philosophies. That's not always the most exciting territory to be in if we're only looking at the extremes. A Pixel will probably win for people who only want to push a shutter button with no additional input or control. And a V20 will crush it for those folks mounting their phones on tripods to dial in exactly the composition that they want. But few phones will cover as broad a range of consumers with very good to excellent performance in a majority of shooting scenarios as the Galaxy S8. It's a top-tier all-rounder, even if it's rarely the master of a specific feature. Did you know that a moose can dive underwater down to nearly 20 feet in search of food? We'd like to thank our sponsor dbrand for reminding us that if you're going to dive for food near a moose, make sure it's at least 21 feet deep. This bizarre ad and all of our Samsung Galaxy S8 coverage is brought to you by dbrand. Check them out in the link below. As always, thanks so much for watching. These camera reviews still need your support. This is a substantial amount of work to do this deep of an examination, and sharing is greatly appreciated if we're going to continue producing these reviews in the future. For Pocketnow, I'm Juan Carlos Bagnell, author of Take Better Photos, Smartphone Photography for Noobs. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Some Gadget Guy, and I will catch you all on the next review.